On a cold, rainy night in Portland, the retired service dog, Echo, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He ignored the command of his owner, the veteran David, and stubbornly pulled him into a dark alley filled with the scent of dampness and despair. Beneath a sheet of rain-soaked cardboard, a man was huddled, his body shivering, his gaunt face lost in the shadows. The man seemed lost to the world, but as Echo gently nuzzled his freezing hand, a faint metallic glint suddenly flashed in the darkness, hinting at a secret that had been buried for a decade. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. What city or state are you listening to this story from? The Portland rain was a relentless, chilling whisper against the windshield of David's old pickup truck. It was a sound he knew well, a constant companion during the long Oregon autumns. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Echo, a retired German shepherd whose once solid black and tan coat was now a distinguished salt and pepper gray, especially around his noble muzzle. At 9 years old, Echo moved with the quiet dignity of a seasoned veteran, his intelligent brown eyes mirroring the calm, steady demeanor of the man beside him. David himself was a man shaped by time and experience. In his early 40s, he had the lean, resilient build of a lifelong soldier, though his quiet life now was a world away from his past in the Army. Short brown hair was neatly cut, yet silver had already staked its claim at his temples, framing a face that was more kind than it was hard. He was wearing his usual evening uniform for their volunteer runs, a worn brown leather jacket over a faded flannel shirt, comfortable jeans, and sturdy work boots. Together, he and Echo spent 2 nights a week delivering hot meals and blankets to the city's forgotten corners, a small ritual of purpose in a quiet life. They were about to call it a night when Echo suddenly stirred. A low whine rumbled in his chest, and his ears, usually relaxed, shot straight up. He pressed his nose against the damp window, his entire body tensed and focused on the mouth of a narrow, unlit alley they were passing. "What is it, boy?" David asked softly, his hand instinctively going to the dog's neck. He trusted Echo's senses more than his own. The dog had been his shadow, his partner, his early warning system through 2 tours, and retirement hadn't dulled those instincts one bit. Echo whined again, a note of urgency in the sound, and looked from the alley back to David. That was all the confirmation David needed. He pulled the truck over to the curb, the engine rumbling quietly in the downpour. Leaving the warmth of the cab, they were swallowed by the cold and the dark. The alley was a slick, black throat, smelling of damp concrete and refuse. Echo led the way, his paws nearly silent on the wet pavement, his body low and alert. He moved with a certainty that pulled David forward through the gloom. There, huddled against a brick wall beneath a flimsy shelter of wet cardboard, was a shape. At first, David thought it was just a pile of discarded rags, but as they drew closer, the shape resolved into a man. He was probably around David's age, rail-thin and shivering, his face gaunt and his eyes staring into a distance only he could see. He was the very picture of hopelessness. Echo did not bark. He approached the huddled figure slowly, his movements gentle. He nudged the man's cold, listless hand with his wet nose. The man didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice. But as Echo nudged him again, his fingers uncurled just enough to reveal a faint glint of metal against his palm. David's breath caught in his throat. He knelt in the damp, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, clutched in the stranger's hand, was a single mud-caked military dog tag. And as David wiped away the grime, the name stamped into the metal seemed to burn into his soul. Mark Rennick, his best friend, his brother in arms. The man who had been declared missing in action almost a decade ago. The city's 24-hour support center was a jarring assault of fluorescent light and echoing voices after the quiet dark of the alley. The man, whom David had simply registered as John Doe, flinched the moment they stepped inside. He seemed to shrink, his entire body coiling in on itself as a young, well-meaning shelter worker named Sarah approached with a clipboard and a kind smile. He recoiled from her gentle voice as if it were a physical blow, his wild eyes darting towards the door. It was only Echo's solid presence pressed against his leg that kept him from bolting. The German Shepherd stood as a calm, furry anchor in a sea of overwhelming stimuli, his body a silent statement of protection. "He won't respond to anyone," David explained quietly to Sarah, his gaze fixed on the broken man. "He only seems to be calm when the dog is near." Sarah nodded with practiced understanding, her eyes full of pity, but it was clear that this place, with its necessary rules and bustling energy, was a source of terror for John Doe. Watching him tremble under the bright lights, David felt a fierce, protective instinct rise within him. He couldn't leave him here. He wouldn't. This environment would shatter what little was left of the man. After signing a stack of forms and promising to be fully responsible, David led his silent charge back out into the rain. David's house was a small, tidy bungalow on the quiet edge of Portland, a sanctuary of wood and warm light. A fire was soon crackling in the hearth, pushing back the evening's chill. But the warmth didn't seem to reach John Doe. He ignored the clean clothes David left for him, refused the warm mug of broth, and found the darkest corner of the living room, where he sank to the floor. He was a ghost haunting the edges of the room, present only as a vessel of fear. But he was not entirely alone in his corner. Echo, after a brief patrol of the house, approached the man not with the insistent urgency he'd shown in the alley, but with a quiet, solemn companionship. The old shepherd lay down a few feet away, emitting a low, contented sigh. Slowly, inch by inch, he shuffled closer until his thick, gray and white coat was pressed against the man's shivering side. There was no resistance. For the first time that night, a sliver of peace seemed to settle over John Doe. Later, when David placed a plate of beef stew on the floor, the man only stared at it with those same empty eyes. It wasn't until Echo got up, nudged the plate with his nose, and looked at him that John Doe finally began to eat. He even pushed a small piece of meat towards the dog with a trembling finger. All evening, his hand remained buried in Echo's fur, a lifeline in a world he no longer understood. Watching them from his armchair, David's heart ached with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. This profound trauma, this complete erasure of self, this instinctual trust in a dog over any human. It had to be Mark. This was the damage of war, the unseen wounds he himself knew all too well. He looked at the dog tag glinting on his mantelpiece, then back at the broken man finding solace in his dog. The decision was made. He would not call the army. He would not hand his friend over to a system of protocols and evaluations. He would find a way to bring Mark back from the silence himself. The days settled into a quiet, tense rhythm in David's house. With methodical patience, David began his self-designed memory therapy. He would sit on the living room floor, an old photo album spread open, with John Doe sitting across from him. Echo always served as a bridge, lying faithfully between them, his head resting on his paws, but his ears alert to every sound. David would point to faces in the photographs, young men squinting in the desert sun, their arms slung around each other. "This was us at the outpost," he'd say, his voice soft. "Remember the dust? It got into everything." He played the gritty rock and roll they used to blast from a cheap speaker, music that was the soundtrack to their youth. The man, his John Doe, would sometimes react, but the responses were fleeting, like ripples on a deep, dark pond. A furrow in his brow at the sight of a particular face, a slight tremor in his hand when a familiar guitar solo screamed from the speakers. They were just shattered whispers, not a breakthrough. The silence that followed each attempt was heavy with David's hope and a growing sense of frustration. The man before him remained a locked room, and David couldn't find the key. One afternoon, David turned to a page with a photo that always made him smile. It was Mark, his grin wide and carefree, his arm thrown around a goofy-looking yellow Labrador. "That was Sully," David chuckled, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. "You always said that dog had more heart than sense." As he spoke, Echo, who had been dozing, lifted his head. He rose, walked over to the album, and whined. He looked intently at the photograph of Mark and Sully, then nudged David's hand with his muzzle, pushing it towards the picture. He let out a single sharp bark. It wasn't an alarm, it was a demand for attention. David was stunned into silence. "What is it, boy? Did you know Sully?" The reaction made no sense, but it was deliberate, specific. It was another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. The nights were when the true battle began. The quiet of the house would be violently torn apart by a muffled cry from the spare bedroom. The first time it happened, David ran in to find John Doe thrashing in his bed, his face a mask of pure terror, tangled in his sheets and fighting an unseen enemy. But before David could even cross the room, Echo was already in motion. The German Shepherd moved with the swift efficiency of a trained professional. He leaped onto the bed, not with aggression, but with purpose. He began to whine softly, and then he laid his entire 70-pound body across the man's chest and shoulders. It was a firm, steady weight, a living blanket of pressure. Almost instantly, the man's thrashing subsided. His breathing, which had been ragged and panicked, evened out. The terror receded from his face, leaving only exhaustion. David watched in awe. It was a textbook deep pressure therapy maneuver, a technique used to ground someone in the midst of a severe panic attack or nightmare. Echo wasn't just comforting a scared man. He was treating a wounded soldier. The close confines of the house had become a gentle prison of failed hopes. Believing that a change of scenery might shake something loose, David decided to drive them out to the Oregon coast. Maybe the vast, open horizon of the Pacific could offer a space for a trapped mind to breathe. As they left the city behind, the landscape softened into rolling green hills before giving way to the rugged, misty coastline. The air grew thick with salt and the distant, rhythmic roar of the ocean. John Doe sat silently in the passenger seat, his gaze as empty as it had been for weeks, with Echo resting his head peacefully on the man's lap. They parked and walked towards a bluff overlooking a stretch of shoreline famous for its dramatic, dark rock formations. It was a gray, overcast day, and the sea was in a turbulent mood. Powerful waves, the color of steel, relentlessly assaulted the shore, exploding into plumes of white spray against the black, jagged rocks. The sound was immense, a constant, thunderous percussion that vibrated deep in your chest. For a few minutes, John Doe just stood there, a frail figure against the immense, wild backdrop. David watched him, a silent prayer on his lips. Then it happened. The trigger wasn't a single sight or sound, but the overwhelming chaos of it all. The relentless, crashing roar seemed to bypass his conscious mind and strike directly at his trauma. A guttural scream, raw and full of a pain that was clearly not of the present moment, was ripped from his throat. He staggered back, clutching his head as if to keep it from splitting apart. His eyes, usually so vacant, were now wide with a terrifying, vivid horror. He was no longer on a cliff in Oregon. He was reliving a hell David could only imagine. Panic seized him. He scrambled to his feet with a desperate agility and ran. But he wasn't running away from the cliff edge. He was running towards it, towards the deadly, churning water below. For one horrifying second, David was frozen, realizing he was too far away to stop him. It was a dead sprint towards oblivion. But he had forgotten about the other soldier on duty. In a flash of gray and white fur, Echo exploded into action. He covered the ground between them in a heartbeat, a blur of focused intent. He didn't nip or bite. He slammed his body into the man's path, a solid, immovable wall of loyalty. Planting his feet, Echo let out a volley of deep, authoritative barks, a sound so sharp and commanding it momentarily pierced through the roar of the ocean and the man's inner turmoil. John Doe stumbled, his frantic momentum broken. As he tried to sidestep, Echo moved with him, pressing his body hard against the man's legs, physically forcing him away from the edge and pinning him to the damp earth until David could reach them. His own heart hammering against his ribs, crouching beside the sobbing, broken man, David looked at Echo, panting but vigilant, and finally understood. This wasn't just a lost memory. This was a violent, raging storm trapped inside a man's soul, and he was completely, terrifyingly out of his depth. The drive back from the coast was steeped in a heavy, defeated silence. The storm on the shore had mirrored the storm in the man's mind, and David felt the chilling certainty of his own failure. His plan, born of loyalty and desperate hope, had been naive. Back in the quiet of his living room, a sense of despair settled over him like a shroud. He slumped into his armchair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. From the mantelpiece, he took the dog tag. His dog tag, Mark's tag. With a soft cloth, he began to polish it. The repetitive motion, a somber ritual to honor a friend he now felt he had failed twice. Across the room, John Doe sat watching, his breathing still shallow from the ordeal. His eyes were fixed on David's hands, on the piece of metal slowly emerging from its muddy cocoon. As David rubbed, the letters became sharp and clear, glinting in the lamplight. Markrennick. At that moment, Echo rose from his spot by the hearth. He padded silently across the floor, bypassing David completely, and stopped before John Doe. The dog lowered his head, his sensitive nose working intently, sniffing the tattered old army jacket the man still wore. He focused on the right breast pocket, its seam torn and frayed. A low whine escaped his throat, and he began to paw at the spot, a gentle but insistent scratching. "What is it, boy?" David murmured, his own grief interrupted by the dog's odd persistence. He leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. Following Echo's lead, David reached out and gently felt the torn pocket. Deep inside the lining, his fingers brushed against a small, crinkled object. His heart began to pound. With delicate care, he worked it free. It was a tiny scrap of paper, yellowed with age, sealed inside a grimy, makeshift plastic wrap. With trembling hands, David peeled the plastic away and unfolded the note. The writing was in pencil, faint and hurried, the words of a man running out of time. "Tell David, I'm sorry." David's breath hitched. He looked from the cryptic message to the man, whose eyes were now wide, locked on the note. David held it out, along with the now gleaming dog tag in his other hand. The man's gaze flickered between the familiar handwriting on the paper and the sharp, undeniable name on the tag. The two artifacts, a final message and a final identity, converged in his mind. And the dam broke. A sob, raw and ragged, tore through the silence. It was not the shriek of a nightmare, but a wave of pure, undiluted grief. Tears streamed down his face, carving clean paths through the layers of grime. He looked at David, and for the first time, his eyes were not empty. They were present, and they were filled with a decade of unshed sorrow. His voice, when it finally came, was a rasping whisper, but it was the clearest sound David had ever heard. I'm not Mark." He took a shuddering breath, his entire body shaking with the force of the unleashed memory. "My name is Robert. I was there when he fell." In the sacred silence of the living room, the story finally spilled out. Through racking sobs, Robert recounted the fragmented, horrific memories that had just crashed back into his consciousness. He spoke of chaos, of dust and smoke, of an ambush that had decimated his unit near a rocky ridge. He was the only one left, wounded and disoriented, when he stumbled upon Mark, who was leaning against a rock, his wounds mortal. In those final precious moments, Mark, with a strength born of pure will, had pressed the dog tag into Robert's hand. He had made him promise. "Find David," Mark had gasped. Tell him, it wasn't his fault. Tell him to live a good life. For both of us." The sheer weight of that promise, combined with the profound guilt of being the one who lived, had been too much for Robert's mind to bear. It had simply shattered, erasing his name, his past, and the promise he was meant to keep. Now, looking David in the eye, his own gaze finally clear, Robert delivered the message he had carried in the dark for a decade. He spoke of Mark's bravery, of his final thoughts, of his unshakable faith in his friend. For David, the words were a release, a key unlocking a chamber of his own guilt that he had kept sealed for years. It was a moment of shared grief so profound that it felt like a cleansing fire, bringing a painful but necessary peace to the memory of the man they both had lost. The grief slowly gave way to a new purpose. With David's help, the calls were made. A veterans network, a missing persons database. The name Robert Miller, Michigan A, and presumed dead by all but his own family, was still active in the hearts of those who refused to give up. They found his wife and daughter living only 3 hours away, having never moved from the home they had once shared. The next day, David drove Robert to a quiet suburban street lined with oak trees. Robert stared out the window at a small blue house with a well-tended garden, his face a mixture of terror and longing. "I can't," he whispered. David put a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, you can. You're home." As Robert shakily got out of the car, a woman in her 40s looked up from watering her flowers. The can slipped from her hand, clattering on the pavement. Her eyes, which had held a decade of sadness, widened in disbelief. A teenage girl with Robert's eyes appeared at the screen door, her hand flying to her mouth. Time stood still for a heartbeat, and then broke as Robert's wife whispered his name, and the three of them rushed together in a tangle of tears and long overdue embraces. David watched from the truck, not wanting to intrude. He felt a peace settle over him, a sense of closure that was deep and true. He placed his hand on Echo's head, the fur warm and familiar beneath his palm. The old shepherd looked up at him, then back towards the weeping, laughing family. Echo stood beside him, a silent, steady guardian, the loyal dog who had not just saved one life, but had navigated the lost back to the living and brought a final, healing peace to the dead. Echo's story reminds us that the deepest wounds are often the ones no one can see. And sometimes, the most profound healing doesn't come from words or grand gestures, but from the quiet, unwavering loyalty of a friend who refuses to let us be lost in the dark. If this story of loyalty and second chances touched your heart, we invite you to become part of our community by subscribing. Your likes and shares help these stories reach others who may need a message of hope. Please let us know in the comments what this story meant to you. Another tale of an unbreakable bond is waiting for you on the screen right now, and we think you'll love it.